necessity or the urgency of the situation. So in that meeting, some of the things that Mrs. Smith spoke with her staff about or her department members about are the whys, the where, the what, the when, the how, and the who for the intervention. So some of the questions that she started by asking, what do we hope to achieve from this intervention? So before we can sit to plan and sit to put together all the other plans for the intervention, we need to decide at the beginning what it is that we hope to achieve. We need to look at the big picture, what it is that our aim is. So it is critical that we look at the objectives of the intervention. What information will we begin with? Where will we source our information? Where do we begin with our intervention? Is another critical question we need to be asking ourselves as we think about putting an intervention plan together or thinking about creating an intervention program. Where will we get baseline data information to begin with? How and when will we implement? What activities and strategies will be used to treat with the learning gaps identified? And as I said before, these are questions that we need to be asking, that we need to be pondering as we try to put our intervention plan or program in place. What mechanism will we use to monitor student progress and the effectiveness of the program? Because as we plan our intervention, it is critical to think about monitoring student progress. Because if we're going to measure the effectiveness of the program, a part of measuring the effectiveness is to look at how well students are progressing or students not progressing. If it is that we measure the effectiveness of the program as well, we need to measure that effectiveness to determine if changes need to be made in the intervention program based on where we are and how it is that things are being implemented. So it's critical to look at monitoring student progress and the effectiveness of the intervention program. We also need to look at how it is that we will reach these students. How is it that they will be grouped? What strategies will we be using with these set of students? So with these questions in mind, Mrs. Smith from Longville Secondary High went ahead and they coined a plan of action. If you're seeing, what I would want to show you is a sample of the action plan that Mrs. Smith came up with and her team came up with. And from this, the hope is that we get what it is, what are the elements that we need to consider when we are actually putting an intervention plan in place. Some of the elements, of course, we need to consider the various phases of the intervention. What it is that we need to do before we actually put the intervention in place, before we actually implement. So for that, we will call that a phase one, which we refer to now as the pre-implementation phase. It is critical, of course, for us to be contacting the parents of the students who are going to be involved in the intervention. Because it may be that for the intervention, it may be happening outside of the hours that are stipulated, or it may just be that the students will be engaged for extended hours. So parents need to be notified and we need to get permission from the parents as well. So in this particular phase, we're looking at informing the parents and disseminating information through letters and personal conversations. So at this stage, we find that we are contacting the parents, whether it is through emails, through letters, through phone calls, and getting them to actually accept the proposal that we are making as a school for engaging our students for them to I'm sorry, be I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, for them to at least reach the basic proficiency on leaving high school. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Also for phase 2, we're thinking about the implementation. For the implementation, we are looking at what will happen while we are actually putting the program in place. What are some of the things that we will consider doing while putting the program in place? The strategies, what will happen with the students first, what strategies will we use, how it is that we will be grouping the students, how long will they be engaged for, the dates that the implementation will take place. We are now looking at what will happen at the implementation phase. For the third phase of this implementation, we're looking at the evaluation of the implementation itself. So what we're saying here is that we're looking at what will happen in different phases. Some of the elements that are critical are the considering the goals or the objectives. So in creating an intervention action plan, we need to state what the goals, objectives are for each phase of the intervention. And for each phase, we talk about the pre-implementation phase, the actual implementation, and the post-implementation phase, which would have been the final evaluation of the intervention. We need to outline also the persons who will be involved in each phase, the persons who will be needed to ensure that each phase of the intervention runs smoothly. Whether it's going to be parents, the students, the teachers, just about whoever will be needed so that the phase itself runs smoothly. We also need to consider the resources that will be needed at each phase. So for this sample, the resources that they needed for the phase 1 at Longville Secondary High would have been the letters to the parents, contact numbers so that they can get in touch with the parents, or email addresses if there exists. For the phase 2, we talk about the implementation. We talk about the resources that we will need to gather the data. So if it is that we're going to be using diagnostic tests to assess where the students are at, or to diagnose where the students are at for the beginning of the intervention, we need to indicate the resources needed. In this case, it would have been the diagnostic test papers. And because we are paying attention to both the City and Guilds and the CSEC students, we are looking at both the CSEC diagnostic and the City and Guilds diagnostic test items. Also critical to the planning of the intervention are to set dates or timeframes for each phase of the intervention. So timeframes are extremely important here in this planning phase. The other critical aspect is for us to determine how it is that we will determine that each phase is a success. So what it is that we will use to determine that the pre-implementation phase is successful? How will we determine that the implementation is successful? And how will we determine that the post-implementation is successful, which would have been the final evaluation? So just to run a summary of what we just spoke of is that critical to this planning phase are the elements that we need to consider for the planning of the intervention. We need to consider the phases. We need to consider the goals and the objectives. We need to consider the activities or strategies for each phase, the resources needed for each phase, as well as the time frame and the success indicator for each phase. So let's move back to the presentation itself. Right, so what we did was just to summarize here. So we recognize that for phase one, we talk about the pre-implementation. We talk about for the pre-implementation, what is involved is the dissemination of information to parents, whether it is through letters, personal conversations, or emails. And we would have had Longville High for their plan would have had the second week of February 2021 for the pre-implementation phase. For phase two of the, it would have been the implementation phase. And for that phase, for them, it's administering the diagnostic test, analyzing the test results, and mentioning or making note of the student engagement sessions. For those, they would have indicated the dates, the time frame, which would have been February 15, and the week of February 22 to March 19, 2021. And for the third phase, which would have been the post-implementation, we're seeing that the activities there would have been the evaluation of student progress and also the evaluation of the effectiveness of the program. And for that phase, there's also a time frame, and the time frame would have been for Longville Secondary High would have been March 20, 2021. So this actually would summarize what it is that Longville High had proposed for their intervention by way of action plan. So something for us to think about as we press forward. Looking at the action plan that, or the plan of action for intervention that Longville Secondary High came up with, what issues based on what is happening may Longville High encounter based on their plan of action? So the plan of action for schools may look differently based on the situation that exists at the school. So your plan of action may not necessarily look like this one for Longville Secondary High because your context may very well be different. So what we're encouraging you to do is to look at your context, look at the issues with which you are faced, and in your intervention action plan, plan to address the issues based on your current situation. Because the issues may differ from school to school. Looking at the action plan for Longville Secondary High, what adjustments, if you reflect on your particular situation, and if you are going to be putting an action plan or an intervention plan in place for your school, how could you adjust this action plan to suit your particular context? Remember that we also said before that the context for each school is different. So the plan of action may include different activities, different strategies. For an intervention, it is important that we recognize that we are meeting our students before us where they are. Students are at different stages, different development stages. So we meet them where they are, plan for them where they are based on our context. So the case with Mrs. Smith is that they would have completed now the pre-implementation activities, and they already went ahead and they administered their diagnostic test to both the CSEC and to the City and Guilds group of students. They met, they decided at that school that they would collaborate as a department, and they would be looking together, looking at the test results together to determine now from the group of CSEC students and from the group of City and Guild students, which set of students of the group of students are at risk for getting, let's say, a grade 4 or below a grade 3 for the CSEC or the City and Guilds examinations, or pass for the City and Guilds examinations. So what they actually did was to group the students or group the scores, and they would have considered from the set of students, those students who end up in the lower 10 percentile. These students, they would have taken out of the group, large group of students, and would have placed them or selected them for a small group instruction. So let's look at what we refer to as the lower 10 percentile. So let's say there were 40 students in this particular CSEC group. Of the 40 students, or 10% would have, say, been 4 students. So of that 40 students, they recognized that there were 4 students who were actually at risk for actually getting a grade 4. So these students are going to be earmarked for or targeted for targeted small group instruction. We recognize that based on this particular case, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that only 4 students were in the lower 10 percentile based on the selection. But as teachers, the teachers actually know the students. They actually know what they're capable of. They know what their students, the weaknesses of their students. So what we recognize also is that based on this particular case, students were recommended by their teachers for the small group or the targeted instructions. This means that for selecting our students, we're at liberty, if we know our students, know what they're capable of, we know what their weaknesses are, we can also recommend that these students be placed in the group for the targeted instructions. So along with the students who are in the lower 10 percentile, we're also saying that as teachers, we can recommend students for targeted instructions by virtue of what we know of them. So for this case, the diagnostic test was administered, the results were analyzed, and the students were grouped. So what I would want you to reflect on here is how it is that the students were actually selected for targeted instructions. And if I may repeat that, it's looking at the lower 10 percentile of students based on their performance, and also based on recommendations by the teachers in the department by virtue of what they know about the students. So based on what is happening or what happened here, do you think this proposal for Longville High, where the lower 10 percentile was selected and recommendations were made for the students who should be placed in a targeted group, what do you think are the effectiveness of this kind of proposal for core instruction at Longville Secondary High? If you so desire, you can type your thoughts in the chat. All right, so after the diagnostic test was administered and the students were identified, what we're saying is that the students were here now grouped for core instruction. And for core instruction, we are looking at the structure of core instruction for the intervention. So this is where the entire group of students who were selected for the intervention would have been meeting as a general class. They would have been given the general instructions based on the curriculum or the syllabus. But those students who were selected for targeted instruction will still be a part of this core instructional group. However, within the core instructional group, this set of 4 students would be given targeted instructions based on their weaknesses. So the structure of core, one of the suggestions for the structure of this core instruction would have been having a mini lesson or a whole group teaching lesson with a set of students who were selected for the intervention. Following this, so this mini lesson or this whole group instruction would last for, let's say, about 10 to 15 minutes of the instruction. Following that, the students will be given work time, and work time can take different formats. Work time, they can get work time in small groups, where in the small groups they can be conferring with each other. And of course, we have to bear how we make the small groups now, bearing all the protocols in mind based on the situation that is existing with COVID-19. So they can also work independent and they can also collaborate. If it is that work time is going to happen, let's say on a virtual platform for some students, small groups can happen, whether it is WhatsApp grouping, or if it is that you are utilizing Google Meet or the Zoom platform. Of course, we know we have the sections where we can have breakout rooms, so we can place these students in small groups, and in those small groups, they can actually be collaborating, talking to each other during this small group work time. Following this small group work time, what we have subsequent to that is where the students now, based on the small group discussions or the independent work time, the students now actually share what it is that they would have been discussing based on the content that would have been addressed in the whole group teaching. Is there any questions or anything you need clarification on? Feel free to type in the chat. Mr. Edgil, Mrs. Kameh Johnson-Borrell will also be looking at your comments. If you have comments also, feel free to share them. So for this core instruction, having looked at the structure, the decision that Longdale Secondary High made is actually to be engaging the students for 90 minutes of mathematics instruction every day to all the students. While they are engaging the students with this mathematics instruction, it is critical to recognize that the core mathematics program, which would be coming from the CSEC syllabus or the curriculum, is also incorporated in this core instruction, because we're actually teaching the students based on what they should have been the content that they should have been getting based on the syllabus or the curriculum that exists. It is important to note that for this core instruction, we need to be having a mechanism to be monitoring the progress of the students while they are engaged in this core instruction. So what we're seeing here is that Longdale Secondary High, the first step that they would have made is to have the students in a group where they are giving to them the core, giving to all students in the group the core instruction. So for them, there is one group with the CSEC students getting core instruction, and one group with the City and Guild students getting the core instruction, and they're monitoring the students' progress. Now, that is how they implemented their intervention. So in monitoring the intervention implementation, one of the things we recognize that the HOD, one of the mechanisms that the HOD put in place is to have routine check for the intervention sessions. For the routine check, on one routine check, it was observed that in some cases, The instruction was inadequate and incorrectly focused for the group of students. Also, there was no frequent monitoring of student progress. So this is a case or an issue that the HOD would have come up with. So if this is the case, meaning that the instruction is inadequate or the instruction is incorrectly focused based on the group of students that are there, this will have an impact on the effectiveness of the program and the ability to evaluate the progress that the students have made based on the objective of the intervention. So how do you think this will impact the effectiveness of the program if the instruction given to the group of students is inadequate and if the instruction is not focused correctly for the group of students that are being engaged? For this also, something you can think about, and you can type your responses in the chat. Feel free to type your responses in the chat. So let us look at how Mrs. Smith addressed the issue of the inadequate instruction and the incorrectly focused instruction for the group of students. What Mrs. Smith actually did was to arrange a capacity building session for the teachers who are engaged in the intervention. From this capacity building session, what she would have addressed would have been some instructional strategies that could be used to engage the students. The instructional strategies that are actually listed here are just suggestions or very few of the strategies that can be utilized to engage the students. And we would have seen some of them coming out in the previous case that we looked at. There is whole group instruction, there is small group instruction, of course, there is paired instruction, there is independent practice, and there is learning centers. We looked at inadequate initially, because remember that there is a small group of 4 students who are in the group for core instruction. So the inadequate instruction came up based on the idea that these 4 students who were placed in, who were supposed to be given targeted instruction, were not given targeted instruction. They were actually still being engaged in the whole group and no attention was being paid to them. So in this case, the HOD would have suggested that there be small group targeted instruction taking place for these students, or the students can be paired, or they can also be given activities for independent practice. So within the group for core instruction, of course, learning centers can also be set up for these students so that they can actually be interacting with the math content for these centers while core instruction is actually happening. So there is one thought. The other issue that existed, was that there was actually no monitoring of the progress of the students. So there is one thought by Warren Bennis who says that an intervention without progress monitoring is just an activity. So what we need to be mindful of is that when we do design and implement our intervention, it is critical that the progress of the students be monitored. If the progress of the students is not monitored, what we're actually doing, we're just running an activity within the school. And this intervention, we will not know if the students would have progressed or what will happen to them at the end of the session. So the HOD would have at least made some suggestions, and the suggestions would have been to at least arrange a time frame for the frequency of monitoring the student's progress. It could be monthly, it could be weekly, it could be bi-weekly. Again, it depends on your context and the students that you're engaging. The suggestion is also to ensure that there is a tool that is created to monitor the progress of the students. Tool created so that there can be a record of where the students were at when they started the intervention, how much progress they would have made at the end of the first period of the progress monitoring. And as the intervention progresses, how it is that they are progressing towards the end of the intervention. So this progress monitoring tool would actually be recording for the students how it is that they are progressing over the period of time, because it's critical to assess that based on this model that the school is actually using. It is also important to ensure that the students know their goal and that the teachers know the goal that they would want for the students in the intervention program, because that is how you will know if the students are actually progressing towards a particular goal or if it is that they are reaching their goal. All right, so you determine how frequently you collect this data, which is what I would have said before, and also to review what is happening with the students at each period of the intervention. So as we press forward, we look at what happens at Longville Secondary High. So remember that the students were engaged in core instruction, and they were engaged in this core instruction for a period of 4 weeks. Now, having engaged in this core instruction, the end of the 4-week period, what we recognize is that at Longville High, the students were actually checked to see if they have made progress or not. Based on this case, we recognize that there were 4 students who were found not to make sufficient progress. So from the core instruction, these 4 students, they were allowed to remain in the core instruction and the same instructions were being used as before. Do you think this was a very wise idea for the students who did not make sufficient progress to remain in the group with core instruction? How will it impact, how will this decision impact the effectiveness of the intervention program? Here, if the students remain, in the core instruction group, and they did not make sufficient progress, it means we would have been defeating the purpose of the intervention where the goal of the intervention for these 4 students. So the suggestion or the response that the HoD gave to this is that these students, we need to earmark these students. We need to now ensure that they are taken from the core group instructional group, and given more targeted instruction in smaller groups. And these instructions could be what they did here would have been for 2 to 3 hours weekly. Now, these students were engaged in smaller groups, and they're suggesting having them in these smaller groups for a period of 6 to 8 weeks. Now, if they're going to be placed in these smaller groups for 6 to 8 weeks, it means that instruction for them needs to be more targeted or will be more targeted based on their needs or based on what was assessed from the core group instruction. The aim of the intervention is to actually allow the students to transition back into the core group. So if it is that they did not make sufficient progress within the core group, they are now taken aside, given more targeted instructions. After having received more targeted instructions, we will now check their progress again to see if they have made any progress or if they have not made any progress. If they have made progress, sufficient enough, they can now transition back to the core group where they are given the core instruction. If they have not made sufficient progress, it means that we will have to now transition these students who have not made progress to another grouping. All right? So in the targeted instruction that the small group of students will now receive, we are providing them with the skills necessary for staying apace with the rest of the class. So we have to ensure that in giving them targeted instruction, we're still actually focusing on helping them now to stay apace with the rest of the group that is within the core instructional group. Also in this targeted instruction, we're actually also integrating mathematical ideas and concepts from other subject areas so that they can see math in action and actually relate it to what is happening in their real life. The lesson design in these targeted instructional groups can't be whole group, but it also has to facilitate a high level of interaction. Also, for this group, we need to design our activities such that mathematical thinking is promoted. And how do we promote this mathematical thinking in the small groups? We're now placing increased emphasis on the strategies that we use with these students. So strategies could include that these students are provided with guided practice, more guided practice, and also when we're giving them feedback for targeted instruction, we're giving them feedback which will help them to know what their errors are and make corrections, make self-corrections based on their errors or areas of weaknesses. So, following this 6 weeks of targeted instruction for the smaller group of students, the students were checked again. So what we need to recognize, each time we place the students in a group for instruction, whether it is a core group or we take them out for targeted instruction, these students need to be evaluated for progress made. So at the end of the 4 weeks for the targeted instruction, the students were once again evaluated for the progress that they have made. Now, lo and behold, when these students were assessed or evaluated for the progress made, here comes Kamal. Kamal is one of the students who still had marked difficulties with the content. So even though he got more targeted instruction and more time was spent with him in smaller groups, he was still having difficulties. And can I tell you, I know that we can relate to this. And here, Kamal, he has not responded to the additional instruction in the small group any at all. So what it is that we will now do with Kamal that he has not responded? With Kamal, the decision was made now we have to take Kamal by himself now. And taking Kamal by himself, we are now giving him intense individual intervention for a period of, let's say, another 4 weeks. So we now have to individualize how we treat Kamal based on his particular areas of weakness, because we're also assessing his progress to find out if it is that Kamal's problems may be a little bit more than what is required than instructional. All right, so he was given increased time, and the time was an additional 4 weeks, which now sees Kamal having intervention for a period of about 8 to 10 weeks. The Individualized instruction for Kamal is now more intense and supplemental. So for Kamal, we could not now give Kamal the assessment that we would be giving to the rest of the group of students. We now have to individualize his assessment based on what is happening with him. And we will now have to track Kamal's progress more frequently. So at the end of the period of having Kamal for another 4 weeks, which sees Kamal doing probably about 6 to 8 weeks of intervention, or 8 to 10 weeks of intervention, Kamal has still not shown any progress. So what do we now do with Kamal? At this stage, Kamal has to be recommended for special education because his problem is probably much more than content and much more than instruction. So based on what we're seeing, that Longville High adopted a particular model. So we're going to run through again to look at the model that Longville High would have been using. So first of all, what they did, they had the group of students, the entire group of students, and they had them engaged general classroom instruction, where all the students were given this particular instruction as a general group in a general classroom setting. Because it was a general classroom setting and we have students at varied levels, we need to recognize that here, differentiated instruction was actually used. The students were actually guided by the CSEC syllabus or by the gaps were identified in the diagnostic test. And they were engaged for a minimum of 4 weeks. Now, the time for the engagement for this core instruction is also dependent on your context. So for this core instruction and this stage, this would be regarded as a tier 1 of the intervention model that Longville Secondary High actually used. What they moved on to, when they assessed the students and found out that students were not making progress in this general group, they moved students to another group which would have given them targeted instruction. For this targeted instruction, the students were still experiencing academic difficulties, even after having been engaged in core instruction at a tier 1. Now they're given instructions in small groups. Of course, students are in smaller groups, but they are still at different levels. So the strategy of differentiation can still be used here. Here, they are now engaged for a minimum of 6 weeks. Now, this stage where the students are now receiving targeted instruction in small groups, we would refer to this stage as a tier 2. Following tier 2, following a tier 2, they are assessed again for progress. And this is why monitoring of the students' progress is actually important. If the students have not made sufficient progress with the targeted instruction in small groups, they are now transitioned to another stage where they are given individualized instructions. For the individualized instructions, of course, we can continue with various strategies based on the students. And again, the strategies we choose is dependent on the students that we have. The individualized assessments actually take place here. And the time and intensity of the instruction increases with the individualized instruction. Here we're seeing a minimum of 8 weeks. For Longville Secondary High, they chose to do 8 to 10 weeks. All right? What is critical here is more frequent monitoring of the individual students' progress. Because we will want to know whether or not we are reaching them, what decision do we need to make at the end of the intervention. So if they have made progress at the end of the individualized instruction, they can now go back to the targeted instruction group. If they have made sufficient progress with the targeted instruction, they can now be reintegrated with the group that is there for core instruction. So for individualized instruction, we are deeming this as a tier 3. So here we can see the model that Longville Secondary High used actually was a model that has 3 tiers of instruction to it. Tier 1, core instruction, tier 2, targeted instruction, and tier 3, individualized instruction. And this tiered approach to the intervention is what we call the response to intervention model. And what you will see is a model that is called the RTI. And if I may just reiterate or repeat, tier 1 would have been the core classroom instruction, which would have been at the beginning of the intervention, where everybody is engaged in a general classroom setting and given core instruction. Finding that they are still having difficulties based on the core instruction, they are now moved to a tier 2. Tier 2 would have now been the small group instruction, where they are given targeted instruction in small groups. If they still have not made sufficient progress, they now move to a tier 3, which would have been intense individualized intervention. If still no progress for the intense intervention, individual intervention, then we make reference to them for the special education program. So please be reminded that students can be moving from tier to tier depending on the progress made. And this is why progress monitoring is important. So if they are at a tier 2 and they would have made positive progress, we can now reintegrate them with tier 1. If they are at a tier 3 and they have made sufficient progress, we can reintegrate them with tier 2. So the grouping here is flexible and students move according to how they progress in the intervention. So again, I say you see how critical it is for progress monitoring to be happening during the intervention. So let's look at a summary of the implementation. So what we noticed that happened is that at Longville Secondary High, they actually created a schedule. And this schedule reflected dates for diagnostic testing. It reflected dates for implementation. It reflected dates for each phase of the intervention, the pre-implementation phase, the period of time for implementation, and the time for post-implementation or evaluation of the effectiveness of the program. They then moved to conducting the diagnostic tests. Then they moved to analyzing the test results and interpreting the data. It is extremely important, and I'm reiterating, that we need to know where the students are at before we can begin to treat them. This is what the diagnostic test results helps us to do, determine where they are at as we analyze the test results and interpret the data. Then from what is happening with the data, what we're seeing with the students are grouped accordingly. They are placed in a core group for instruction, and within that core group instruction, there can still be this small group of students who receive targeted instruction. It is also critical because we know that as Longville Secondary High did, they actually developed a monthly schedule for intervention at each tier. For them, it was monthly that they would monitor the progress. For your school, it depends on your context again, and it depends on what your situation is. They met and they identified strategies that can be used with the students in each of the tiers. Again, that is critical to expose our teachers or department members to various strategies that can be used at each tier of the intervention. Then we recognize that tier 2 students were met with and given small group interventions. Progress was monitored to determine the effectiveness of the intervention and student progress, and then their findings were being summarized. So that's basically how Longville Secondary High approached there. So if we look at a schedule in summary, For us, this is speaking to universal screener, but the screener for us would have been the diagnostic test. So we put bottom 10% students in tier 2. We deliver tier 1 and tier 2 interventions for 4 weeks before adjusting. So again, the period of time that we use is dependent on our circumstances, on our context, the crunch time with which we are working. We need to be supporting the students at their tiers according to the schedule. So scheduling, is extremely critical for our intervention program and engaging our tier 1 and tier 2 students. Also, progress monitor these students to determine effectiveness of the instruction or the intervention. Because if it is that the students, when we look at how they are progressing, it says to us that majority of the students are not making sufficient progress. It means that we need to revisit how instruction or how the intervention is actually taking place. So based on that summary, that actually brings us to the end of looking at how intervention can actually, we can create an intervention plan and how we can implement using the RTI model of intervention for our students. If it is that we need to be contacting persons within our regions, there you have it on your screens, the names and contact numbers and emails for all regional mathematics coordinators for the 7 regions. And for the rest of this session, we are asking you before you exit or before you ask your questions that you, here we're providing you with the QR code or the link to access the evaluation form. So we're asking you kindly to evaluate the session so that we can know how better to serve you. So the link is being placed in the chat by Mr. Lamar Edu, so you can access the link or the QR code and evaluate the session. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I would want to say thank you very much for staying with us today in this, discussing this intervention implementation. And at this point in time, I now hand it back over to Mr. Edu. Thank you very much again, ladies and gentlemen.
All right. So good afternoon, colleagues. Let me start off by saying thank you to Ms. Meeks for delivering this session to you at this point in time. I am truly pleased with the turnout from you, the participants, and I'm sure that you would have learned much from today's session. As we are here now at the end of the session, let me just quickly remind you that you can leave your email addresses in the chat and we can send you the presentation. And please note that in addition to the link to the evaluation form, we have also as well in the chat the link to the YouTube recording. So if you want to go back and watch this at a later date, you can always do so. So at this time, colleagues, let me just take the time now to open the floor for you to ask any relevant questions or to make comments that you want to leave with us at this point in time. So what you can do, you can utilize the raise hand feature. I'll acknowledge you and then you will go ahead and share. All right. And while it is that you are preparing to share, or if there is nothing that you'd want to share at this point in time, I just want to go over the fact that it is very important as leaders, especially you as middle managers, you are really the backbone of the institutions, and it's really your effort that is going to assist in seeing us through this time where we have COVID affecting us. So as you engage your students and as you try to maneuver this new era and time, you'll realize and you'll find that you have to pull on your intervention strategies in order to treat the gaps. I know for you, you might have recently conducted your City and Guilds assessment for the students who need to sit that examination. And I'm sure the data set can reveal much to you. So as you pull now on this data set to prepare now to engage these students, you need to now analyze the data set, analyze the time you have working with, and see how you can coin an intervention utilizing the resources that you have available to ensure that at the end of the day, the students would have been engaged in a meaningful way. Colleagues, I want to thank you once more for taking the time to be here with us this afternoon. We really appreciate the effort that you put into upskilling and ensuring that you garner the necessary knowledge needed to lead your departments effectively as you traverse through this period of COVID. All the best to you. Remember once more to leave your email addresses in the chat, and we will take that and we'll send the presentation to you. And we'll also send you the YouTube link to this session that you can always share with your colleagues who unfortunately were not able to be here with us today. Once more, all the best to you and have for yourself a wonderful evening.